Welcome to Dead Good Stories. We have some disturbing and scary horror stories to help you sleep tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like, comment, or subscribe. Otherwise, lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. I had always preferred working the late shift at the diner. The stillness of the night made the hours pass quietly, and with fewer customers, it felt like I had the place to myself. That particular night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, something was different. There was a man sitting in the corner booth, a shadow among the dim lights. He wasn't eating or drinking, just sitting there, his eyes fixed on me. At first, I ignored it. Maybe he was just waiting for someone, or perhaps lost in thought. But as minutes stretched into an hour, his presence became impossible to overlook. Each time I turned, his gaze remained steady. I busied myself with wiping counters, pretending not to notice, but a prickling sensation began creeping up my spine. The diner felt colder. The hum of the old ceiling fan and the distant buzz of the neon sign outside usually filled the quiet, but now they seemed oppressive, magnifying the emptiness around me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced over, his eyes hadn't shifted. It was as if he was studying every move I made. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to approach, thinking I could break the tension. But as I walked toward his booth, something changed. The booth was empty. The man had vanished without a trace. No half-finished coffee cup, no sign that anyone had been there at all. My heart pounded as I glanced around, confused and uneasy. I retreated back behind the counter, the silence now suffocating. I tried to shake the feeling, but something made me look up toward the glass door. And there he was. Pressed against the glass, his face was inches away, eyes wide, unblinking. He stared, unmoving, through the door as though expecting me to let him in. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away instinctively, my pulse racing. The door was locked, the lights were off outside, but he stood there, frozen like a figure from a dream I couldn't escape. Time seemed to drag on. He didn't knock or try to force his way in, just stood there watching, his pale face illuminated by the flickering neon outside. I could feel the tension between us, as if something was holding him there, just beyond reach. When morning finally arrived and the first slivers of light crept over the horizon, I gathered my things, eager to leave the diner behind. I glanced one last time at the door. He was gone. I stepped outside, trying to shake off the lingering dread. As I rounded the corner of the building, a shiver ran through me. I felt something close behind me, brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, panic rising, but there was no one there. I walked faster, the sensation of being followed never fully leaving. Even as I reached my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he was still watching. Working late at the office had always been my routine. I liked the quiet, the stillness, after everyone else had gone home. It gave me a sense of focus that was hard to achieve during the day, with phones ringing and people bustling around. On this particular night, the silence felt deeper, the usual hum of the building seeming more distant, almost muted. The lights of the empty cubicles glowed softly, casting long shadows across the office floor. I was alone, tapping away on my keyboard, the only sound breaking the calm. It was peaceful at first, but as the minutes slipped by, an uneasy sensation settled in the pit of my stomach. It started as a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. At first, I dismissed it. Probably a trick of the light or just my tired eyes. But it happened again. I looked up from my screen, scanning the rows of cubicles beyond my desk. Nothing. I took a breath and got back to work, though I could no longer shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, waiting. As the minutes ticked by, the sense of being watched grew stronger. It clung to me, gnawing at the edges of my concentration. I stood up, stretching my legs, and glanced down the aisle of cubicles. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a shadow darting between the desks. My heart skipped, but when I walked over to check, the aisles were empty. The shadows seemed deeper than before, the overhead lights doing little to cut through the gloom. I returned to my desk, but my focus was broken. That unsettling feeling was sharper now, the silence oppressive. I tried to rationalize it, exhaustion, stress, my mind playing tricks on me, but the sense that something, or someone, was near kept gnawing at me. I glanced toward the far end of the room, where the long row of desks disappeared into darkness. The emptiness of the office seemed almost unnatural now, as if it was waiting for something to fill it. As I sat back down, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. That's when I saw it. On the edge of my computer screen, a sticky note that hadn't been there before, stuck haphazardly on the monitor. My breath hitched, and I leaned forward, trying to recall if I had left it there earlier, though I was certain I hadn't. My mind raced, and without thinking, I stood up quickly, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor, breaking the oppressive silence. I gathered my things hastily, throwing glances around the office, scanning the empty desks and dim corners. Something was off. The room felt different, wrong. I walked toward the exit, my heart hammering. Each step felt heavier than the last. Just as I reached the door, the phone on my desk began to ring. The sudden noise shattered the stillness. It echoed through the empty office, unnervingly loud. I hesitated, my pulse racing as the phone continued to ring. I knew the building was empty. No one else was there. The office had been silent for hours, save for the faint hum of machines left on standby. The phone rang and rang, a sound so sharp in the stillness that it felt almost alive. The moment stretched on, filled with nothing but that unrelenting noise. I turned my head just for a second to glance back at my desk across the darkened room. The phone's glow flickered faintly in the dim light. Everything else was still. Then I heard it, just faint enough to question whether it had been real or a trick of my own panic. Breathing. I worked the night shift at a massive shipping warehouse, a sprawling industrial maze with towering shelves that stretched nearly to the ceiling. The place was a labyrinth of steel and concrete, the aisles between the shelves like narrow corridors that seemed to go on forever. The dim glow of overhead lights did little to chase away the shadows, leaving patches of darkness where the light barely reached. The sound of machinery hummed in the background, a steady rhythm that usually became background noise after a while. But that night, something was different. The usual hum seemed distant, muted, like it was receding further into the background than normal. I was scanning boxes, focusing on my work, when I noticed it. A subtle shift in the shadows, a faint flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. At first, I didn't pay it much attention. The mind plays tricks when you're working alone in such a large, dimly lit space. But then it happened again, a shape moving between the towering shelves, just far enough away that I couldn't make it out clearly, but close enough to unsettle me. I paused, listening. The constant hum of the machines echoed through the warehouse, but beneath that familiar sound was something else, a faint rustling, like someone moving quickly through the aisles. My eyes scanned the rows, but I couldn't see anyone. The silence between the sounds began to stretch out, too still, too quiet, as if something was waiting to break it. I shook off the feeling and tried to concentrate on the task at hand, but the uneasy sensation lingered, clinging to the edges of my thoughts. As I continued to work, I couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was nearby. The feeling became sharper, more pressing with every minute that passed. I decided to check the aisles. As I walked down one of the long, narrow corridors, the lights above flickered slightly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move even when I wasn't. I stopped and looked down the row of shelves, peering into the darkness. The rows stretched out into the distance, each one identical to the last, forming an endless grid of towering racks and dimly lit paths. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the aisle, motionless. My heart raced, but I blinked, and in the next instant they were gone. I stood frozen, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen anything. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a reflection off one of the machines. But I knew something felt wrong. I turned back, quickening my pace toward the control room. The fluorescent lights above flickered again, but this time it felt like more than just an electrical quirk. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the corners of the warehouse darker, as if the light was losing ground. My footsteps echoed louder than usual in the empty space, bouncing back at me from the walls. By the time I reached the control room, my skin was crawling. I locked the door behind me and sank into the chair, my eyes scanning the rows of surveillance monitors. I clicked through the cameras, one by one, searching the feeds for any sign of the figure I'd seen. The images were grainy, the dim light from the warehouse making it hard to see much beyond the shelves and pallets. But then something caught my eye. In one of the feeds, I saw myself, walking down an aisle just moments earlier. But as I looked closer, I saw it again. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, trailing me. It moved when I moved, staying just far enough behind that it was barely visible, but it was there. The figure was following me. I frantically rewound the footage, watching it again. There it was, lurking in the background, keeping its distance, but always present. I scrolled through other cameras, searching for any other signs. My fingers shook as I clicked through the feeds, each new angle showing the same thing. The figure was there, always out of focus, just behind me. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. The walls of the control room suddenly seemed too close, the air too still. I stared at the monitors, waiting for some new movement, for the figure to appear again. But the screens remained static, showing nothing but empty aisles. Just as I began to relax, I noticed one last detail that sent a chill through my entire body. The camera outside the control room showed an empty hallway, but there, near the door, was the faint outline of a shadow. I couldn't make out any features, but it was unmistakable. The figure was standing right outside. It was supposed to be a typical late-night grocery run. I had gotten used to the quiet of the store at night, the aisles usually empty except for a few night stalkers moving in the background. It was a comfort in a way to shop without the noise of the day, to have the space to myself. The store felt different at night, quieter, almost hollow, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. That night, as I grabbed my cart and started down the first aisle, I couldn't shake a faint sense of unease. The store was vast and brightly lit, but there was something in the stillness that felt off. The hum of the lights above and the occasional scrape of my cart wheels against the linoleum seemed amplified, echoing in the otherwise silent aisles. As I wandered deeper into the store, the sensation of being alone began to twist, as though the space around me wasn't as empty as it appeared. I was halfway through the produce section when I felt it. It started as a subtle shift, a presence hovering just beyond the edge of my awareness. I couldn't see anything, but there was a weight to the silence now, an odd stillness that pressed around me as if something unseen was watching, waiting. I kept my eyes on the shelves, trying to focus on the task at hand, but it was hard to ignore. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, and the shadows between the aisles seemed darker, heavier. I turned into an empty row of cereal boxes and started down it, my footsteps quiet on the smooth floor. It was then that I noticed the first sign, an abandoned cart, sitting alone in the middle of the aisle. There was no one near it, no sound of footsteps or the soft rustle of movement. It sat there, half filled with random items, like someone had just walked away mid-shop. I slowed, glancing around, but there was no one. As I turned the corner to another aisle, the sensation grew sharper. The store still seemed empty, but the feeling of being followed tugged at me, creeping into the back of my mind with each step. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the quiet getting to me, the store's vastness playing tricks on my senses. But as I passed the frozen food section, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker, barely visible in the glass door of the freezer. A figure. I spun around, but the aisle behind me was empty, stretching out in both directions with no one in sight. My breath quickened, my pulse thudding in my ears. I turned back to the freezer door, staring at the glass, willing myself to look closer. The reflection had been faint, almost like a shadow, but it had been there. I couldn't have imagined it. I stood there for a moment, rooted in place, my eyes darting across the mirrored surfaces of the other freezer doors, but nothing moved. I forced myself to continue shopping, though my senses were heightened, alert to every flicker of movement and distant sound. Each step through the store felt heavier, the silence thickening around me as I moved between the aisles. The shelves seemed taller, more oppressive, and the once bright lights seemed to dim just slightly, as if the store itself was closing in on me. As I neared the end of my trip, heading toward the checkout lanes, I felt it again, that shift, that presence. It was closer now, just out of view, hovering at the edge of my vision. I turned my head, but there was nothing, just empty rows of shelves and neatly stacked products. The quiet was unbearable, stretching out in front of me like an endless void. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I reached the front of the store, breathing a little easier, the lights brighter near the registers, the exit visible beyond the sliding glass doors. But just as I stepped toward the checkout, something made me freeze. The reflection. It was there, in the large glass windows at the front of the store. A figure standing in the middle of an aisle behind me, completely still, watching. I could see them clearly in the glass, a tall, shadowy outline. I felt my chest tighten, the back of my neck burning with the weight of their stare. Slowly, I turned, dreading what I would see. Nothing. The aisle behind me was empty. The rows of shelves stood silent, untouched, as if no one had ever been there. But as I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, I realized something else. The cart that had been filled with my groceries was gone, vanished without a trace. The late-night pharmacy always had a strange stillness to it, a contrast to the buzzing activity it held during the day. The bright, sterile lights reflected off the tiled floors, making everything feel sharper, almost too clean. I had stopped by to grab a few things after a long day, thinking I could be in and out quickly. The store was nearly empty, just me and a cashier behind the counter, lazily flipping through a magazine. The silence was comforting at first, but as I wandered through the aisles, that comfort began to erode. The shelves loomed taller than I remembered, rows of cold medicine, toothpaste, and bandages stretching far beyond my reach. My footsteps were the only sound, soft echoes that seemed to linger longer than they should. I walked down the aisles, collecting the few things I needed, moving deeper into the store where the lights seemed harsher, casting long shadows on the walls. As I reached for something on a high shelf, I felt it, a sensation creeping over me like I wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't the cashier. They were too far away, out of sight behind the counter. This was something closer, almost hovering at the edge of my awareness. I glanced behind me, but the aisle was empty, stretching in both directions, illuminated by the harsh white lights. I shook it off and kept moving, though the unease lingered. The feeling intensified as I neared the back of the store. The aisles seemed longer now, the shelves more narrow, and the sound of my footsteps felt louder, echoing unnaturally in the sterile space. Every once in a while I thought I heard something else, soft, barely perceptible, like a footstep that wasn't mine. But every time I stopped to listen, there was nothing, only silence, hanging heavily between the shelves. I pushed forward, trying to ignore the growing discomfort, but the sensation followed me. It was like a presence just out of sight, lurking in the quiet spaces of the store. I caught myself glancing at the corners of the aisles more frequently, feeling eyes on me where there shouldn't be any. My hands tightened around the basket, knuckles white, as I rounded a corner into the next aisle. That's when I saw it. A figure just a few feet ahead, standing at the far end of the aisle. My heart jolted, a rush of panic rising in my chest. They weren't moving, just standing there, back turned, almost blending into the harsh fluorescent light. For a second I froze, my mind trying to catch up with what I was seeing. But as I blinked, they were gone. The aisle was empty again. I stood there, staring at the empty space where they had been. My pulse raced, and I could feel my breath quicken. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on me. But as I started to move again, I felt it return, that creeping sensation, heavier now, more intense. It followed me through the aisles, always just a step behind, just out of sight. The sense of being watched was overwhelming now, like something was hovering at my back, close enough to feel, but never visible. I tried to speed up, my footsteps quicker now, but no matter how fast I moved, the feeling only grew stronger. The aisles seemed to stretch on endlessly, the exit feeling impossibly far away. I turned corner after corner, hoping to shake the feeling, but each aisle was the same, empty, but charged with an unseen presence that clung to me. I finally reached the front of the store, my basket heavier in my hands than before. Relief washed over me as the bright lights of the register came into view. The cashier was still there, absorbed in their magazine, oblivious to the tension that had been gripping me for the past few minutes. I placed my items on the counter, my hands trembling slightly as I fumbled with my wallet. The cashier rang up the items, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax, to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But just as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something in the reflective glass doors at the entrance. A figure, barely there, standing near the back of the store. They were facing me this time, distant but unmistakable. I hesitated for only a second before pushing through the doors and stepping into the cool night air, the sensation of being watched burning in the back of my mind. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, the bright lights of the store still glaring from behind the glass. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the empty parking lot. But in the distance, Just near the edge of the store's windows, I thought I saw movement, a figure slipping back into the shadows. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was to run into the store, grab a few essentials, and head home. The parking lot was mostly empty, with only a handful of cars scattered around under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, too late for most people to be out grocery shopping, and the store felt almost abandoned as I walked through the automatic doors. The faint sound of a distant radio echoed from the front counter, but aside from that, the store was eerily quiet. I grabbed a cart and made my way down the aisles, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The store was huge, the kind where aisles stretched far beyond what seemed necessary, their shelves towering above. The space between the shelves felt unnaturally large, giving the place a sense of emptiness that made every sound seem louder than it should. My cart's wheels squeaked softly as I moved, the only noise in the vast, empty store. At first I found the quiet soothing. After a busy day, the stillness was a relief, but as I turned into the second aisle, something shifted. There was a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a feeling I couldn't quite place. I glanced around. The aisle was empty, just rows of neatly stacked canned goods and dry foods. I shook off the feeling and continued shopping, chalking it up to fatigue. But as I moved deeper into the store, the sensation returned, stronger this time. It wasn't just the stillness of the store anymore. It was something else, something that tugged at the edges of my awareness. I stopped in the middle of an aisle, standing completely still, and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no shuffling, just the faint hum of the store's lights and the quiet squeak of my cart. I tried to ignore it, continuing down the aisles with my list in hand, but the sensation of being watched never left. Every time I turned a corner, it felt like someone had just been there, standing at the edge of my vision, only to disappear the moment I looked. I scanned the shelves, expecting to see another late-night shopper, but the aisles were always empty. By the time I reached the far end of the store, my unease had grown into something I couldn't ignore. The aisles seemed longer, the spaces between the shelves darker. I felt exposed, as if there was too much space around me and nowhere to hide. My eyes flicked nervously from one end of the aisle to the other, half expecting to see someone standing there watching. I turned into the refrigerated section, the cool air brushing against my skin as I made my way toward the back wall. The glass doors of the freezers reflected the harsh fluorescent light, casting distorted reflections of the store's aisles. As I reached for a carton of milk, I froze. In the reflection of the glass, just beyond the edge of the aisle, I saw something. A figure, partially obscured by the shelves, standing perfectly still. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the aisle behind me was empty. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood there staring down the long row of shelves, waiting for something to move. But nothing did. The store was still, the silence almost crushing now. I turned back to the freezer, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the milk. I glanced at the glass again, expecting to see my reflection and nothing more. But there, just at the edge of the frame, was the figure again. Closer, this time. I dropped the milk, the carton hitting the floor with a dull thud. I spun around once more, but the aisle remained empty. The sensation of being watched was suffocating now, as if there were eyes on me from every corner of the store, though no one was in sight. My heart raced as I grabbed my cart and headed toward the front of the store, moving faster now, the steady squeak of the wheels seeming unnaturally loud. I turned the corner into the bread aisle, eyes scanning the shelves, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain what I'd seen. But the aisle was deserted, just like the others. My palms felt slick against the handle of the cart, and I forced myself to keep walking, the unease growing with every step. I reached the front of the store and started tossing items onto the checkout counter, eager to get out. The cashier was absent, the front desk deserted, and the silence around me felt heavier than before. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the rows of aisles were still and empty. The lights above flickered briefly, casting a momentary shadow that made my stomach twist. I scanned my items quickly, my hands shaking as I bagged them. But just as I reached for my receipt, I caught sight of something in the reflection of the front window. The figure, standing outside, partially obscured by the shadows, watching through the glass. I froze, my eyes locking on the dark silhouette just beyond the automatic doors. It was taller than I had expected, too tall, and its shape was wrong, somehow distorted in a way that didn't make sense. My breath hitched as I stood there, rooted in place, staring at the shadowy form that seemed to be waiting just outside. For what felt like an eternity, I couldn't move. The doors remained closed, the store silent, but the figure didn't leave. It stayed there, a dark, looming presence just beyond the glass, motionless but unnervingly present. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, fixed on me from the darkness outside. Finally, the spell broke. I grabbed my bags and rushed toward the exit, not daring to look back as I shoved through the doors and into the empty parking lot. As I reached my car, my pulse still racing, I glanced back at the store. The lights inside flickered faintly, casting long, distorted shadows against the windows. But the figure was gone. It was late, and the mall had mostly emptied out. I had a few last-minute things to pick up, and the dim, quiet atmosphere of the nearly abandoned shopping center felt unsettling. The usual crowds, the bustling noise of people moving from store to store, were gone. Only the faint echo of my footsteps reverberated through the corridors. The bright lights overhead seemed harsher without the crowd to diffuse them, casting stark shadows across the polished floors. Most of the stores were already closed, their gates drawn down over the windows like metal curtains. The remaining shops, still open, felt like islands in the expanse of darkened storefronts. I made my way through the wide halls, passing by mannequins dressed in the latest trends, their blank faces staring outward from behind the glass. It was quieter than it should have been. I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system, the distant clatter of someone closing up a store, but other than that, silence. I walked deeper into the mall, the brightly lit path ahead narrowing into a corridor where fewer shops were still open. There was something about the stillness that began to feel oppressive. I tried to focus on the task at hand, to remind myself that it was just a quiet evening. But a nagging sensation crept up on me, as though the empty halls weren't as empty as they appeared. I passed by a small electronics shop, its lights still on, but the interior dark, as if it had been left open by accident. Out of habit, I glanced inside, expecting to see rows of gadgets, phones, and computers. Instead, I caught a glimpse of something else. Just a flicker at the edge of my vision. A figure, standing motionless in the shadows near the back of the store. My heart skipped, and I took a step back, but when I looked again, the shop was empty. I laughed it off, convincing myself that it was nothing. A reflection, maybe, or just a trick of the light. But as I continued down the corridor, that uneasy feeling returned, heavier this time. I felt exposed, as though someone was following me, their gaze trailing my every step. I glanced over my shoulder, but the corridor behind me stretched out, empty, lit by the cold glow of overhead lights. I kept walking, a bit faster now, the sounds of my footsteps echoing louder. The few remaining stores seemed farther apart, their lights casting long shadows across the mall floor. I could see the entrance to the department store I was heading toward up ahead, its doors still open, beckoning me in. I felt a wave of relief. I just needed to get what I came for, pay and leave. But as I approached, I felt it again. That sensation of being watched, sharper this time, as if someone was close, much closer than before. I turned my head, scanning the empty corridor behind me. But again, there was nothing. Just the rows of closed storefronts and the endless rows of mannequins behind glass. I hurried into the department store, hoping the familiarity of the brightly lit aisles would ease my nerves. The store was nearly empty, only a few stragglers browsing in the distance. The racks of clothing, the displays of shoes and accessories. It was all too ordinary, too normal. But the feeling of being followed didn't leave me. As I wandered through the aisles, picking up a few items, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was near. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow slipping between the racks of clothes. A figure passing behind a display. But every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. The mannequins scattered throughout the store didn't help, their lifeless forms standing silently at the end of each aisle, dressed in stiff, posed positions, their blank eyes staring outward. I moved to the fitting rooms, hoping to try on the few things I had picked up. The hallway leading to the changing rooms was eerily quiet, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the carpeted floors. As I approached, I noticed that the hallway seemed longer than I remembered, stretching out in front of me in a way that made my stomach twist with unease. I stepped into one of the stalls and closed the door behind me, the silence suddenly claustrophobic. The fluorescent light flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the small, confined space. As I hung my clothes on the hook, I glanced at the mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something. A shape, a figure standing in the reflection, just behind the door. I spun around, but the fitting room was empty. My pulse quickened as I stared at the door, half expecting it to open for someone, or something, to step inside. But the door remained shut. The silence pressed in on me as I stood there, unable to shake the image of that figure in the mirror. I decided to leave, abandoning the clothes and heading back out into the main store. The fitting room hallway seemed darker now, the shadows stretching farther across the floor. As I made my way toward the exit, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The sensation was stronger now, like a heavy presence behind me, moving when I moved, staying just out of sight. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the bright lights of the store's entrance. But as I neared the exit, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just beyond the threshold, in the reflection of the store's wide glass doors, was a figure. They were standing a few feet behind me, barely visible in the reflection, but unmistakably there. I froze. The figure was tall, obscured in the dim light, their features shadowed. They weren't moving, just standing there watching me. My heart raced as I stared at the reflection, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I glanced behind me, expecting to see someone there, but when I turned, the aisle was empty. I rushed toward the exit, pushing through the glass doors and stepping out into the mall's corridor. The hallway outside felt too quiet, the overhead lights buzzing softly. I glanced back at the department store, but the figure was gone. The sensation of being followed didn't fade, though. As I made my way back through the mall, past the empty stores and silent corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me, lingering in the shadows, watching. Every step I took felt slower, more deliberate, as if something unseen was matching my pace. I reached the parking lot, the cold night air hitting my skin, but the unease followed me, lingering long after I had left the empty halls of the mall behind. The grocery store was quiet, bathed in the artificial brightness of the overhead lights. It was late, almost closing time, and the aisles were deserted. I had come in to grab a few things, thinking it would be a quick trip. The stillness should have been calming, but something about it felt wrong. The store was too quiet, the kind of silence that made even the smallest sounds echo unnaturally. The hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud, the soft squeak of my cart's wheels magnified against the silence. I moved through the aisles, my footsteps feeling unnervingly loud on the tiled floor. There were no other shoppers in sight, just rows of neatly stacked products stretching out in front of me. I made my way toward the back of the store, the aisles feeling longer, more isolated. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows along the shelves. As I reached for a box of cereal, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shape, just barely visible, disappearing behind the end of the aisle. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. I looked down the aisle, expecting to see someone, a store employee or maybe another shopper. But it was empty. The shelves, filled with neatly organized boxes and bags, offered no clues. I tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to my imagination. It was late, and I was tired. Maybe I had seen a shadow, or maybe it was just a trick of the lights. Still, I couldn't ignore the prickling sensation that crept up the back of my neck, the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I pushed my cart farther down the aisle, my eyes scanning the shelves, but my mind kept drifting back to that shadow. The store seemed different now, the silence more oppressive. Each step felt heavier, the distance between me and the front of the store growing longer. As I turned into the frozen food section, the chill from the freezers washed over me. The glass doors reflected the store's fluorescent glow, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing behind me in the reflection. My heart skipped, and I spun around, but again the aisle was empty. The reflections in the freezer glass showed nothing but rows of neatly arranged products and my own distorted figure staring back. I continued through the store, grabbing the last few items from my list, but the sense of unease clung to me. Every few minutes I felt as though something was nearby, lurking just beyond my line of sight. Occasionally I would stop and listen, straining to hear anything beyond the hum of the freezers and the faint rustle of products on the shelves. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Just the dull, heavy silence. As I approached the checkout lanes, the sensation grew stronger. My fingers gripped the handle of the cart tightly, my eyes flicking nervously between the rows of empty aisles. I glanced back over my shoulder more than once, convinced I had seen movement behind me. But the aisles remained empty, stretching out in eerie stillness under the bright lights. I placed my items on the conveyor belt and fumbled for my wallet. The cashier, a tired-looking woman, moved with robotic efficiency, scanning my groceries without a word. The beeping of the scanner cut through the silence, but it did nothing to ease the growing tension in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as though something was just beyond the reach of the light, hidden in the shadows of the store. The transaction finished. I hurriedly packed my bags and made my way toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and I stepped out into the dimly lit parking lot. The cool night air hit me, but the unease lingered, wrapping around me like a second skin. The streetlights cast long shadows across the asphalt, and the few scattered cars seemed unnervingly distant. As I loaded my bags into the trunk, I glanced around the parking lot, my eyes scanning the rows of parked cars. I told myself there was nothing to be afraid of, that it was just a quiet night at the store, but the hairs on the back of my neck prickled with tension. Something was wrong. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, my heart pounding as I started the car. The headlights illuminated the empty parking lot ahead, casting long shadows across the pavement. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the tightness in my chest, and backed out of the space. But as I drove toward the exit, something in my rearview mirror caught my attention. At the far edge of the lot, just outside the pool of light cast by the street lamps, was a figure. They stood still, almost blending into the darkness, watching. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed my foot down harder on the accelerator, not daring to look back. I sped out of the parking lot, the unsettling image of that figure lingering in my mind. My pulse raced as I glanced in the mirror again, half expecting to see the figure behind me, following, but the road was empty. The lights of the grocery store faded into the distance, but the unease didn't leave. Even as I pulled onto the main road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there, watching, waiting. When I finally reached home, I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. But the feeling stayed with me, a lingering presence that seemed to hover just beyond the reach of the light, hidden in the shadows. Even as I sat in the safety of my living room, I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the darkness, still watching, waiting. The convenience store was a haven of light and warmth in the otherwise empty strip mall. It was late, and the street outside was deserted, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of wind. The store's fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a bright, almost harsh glow over the aisles of snacks, beverages, and household items. I was just picking up a few things, milk, bread, some late-night snacks, hoping to be in and out quickly. Inside, the store was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The steady beep of the register was the only sound as I moved down the aisles, the shelves stocked with neatly arranged products. The store felt unusually empty. The usual background noise, the hum of the air conditioning, the occasional chime of the doorbell when someone entered, was absent, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I grabbed the items on my list and moved through the aisles, but something about the stillness was unsettling. The shelves, filled with neatly organized goods, seemed to stretch on endlessly. I felt a growing sense of unease as I wandered deeper into the store, the emptiness making every noise, no matter how small, seem louder than it should. As I reached for a carton of milk, a sudden chill brushed against my skin, though the store was comfortably warm. I looked around, half expecting to see someone there, but the aisles remained empty. My heart began to race, the silence pressing down on me. I shook off the feeling and continued shopping, but every so often I would catch a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Something shifting in the shadows of the shelves, a fleeting glimpse of a figure disappearing around a corner. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I had been working long hours lately, and exhaustion could play tricks on the mind, but as I turned into another aisle, the feeling intensified. The store seemed to contract around me, the aisles narrowing, the lights dimming just slightly. The sense of being followed grew stronger, as though someone was moving just behind me, their presence palpable even if I couldn't see them. I turned into the snack aisle, scanning the shelves for my favorite chips. The fluorescent lights flickered momentarily, casting a brief shadow that made me jump. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The aisle was as empty as the others. I shook my head, trying to brush off the growing anxiety. I reached the back of the store where the shelves were stocked with household items. Here the silence was even more pronounced, the occasional creak of the store's infrastructure echoing in the stillness. I grabbed a bottle of detergent and turned to head back to the front. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing at the far end of the aisle, their silhouette dark against the bright shelves. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly turned back around, pretending to browse the shelves in front of me. I could feel my pulse quickening as I tried to focus on the products. But the figure didn't move. They stayed there, still, watching. I dared to glance over my shoulder again, but the aisle was empty once more. My anxiety was mounting, the sensation of being observed growing stronger. I pushed my cart quickly, heading back toward the front of the store, the cart's wheels squeaking loudly against the tile. At the checkout counter, I could feel the cashier's eyes on me as I unloaded my items. They were behind the counter, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension in the store. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone standing just out of view, but every time I looked, the aisles remained empty. I paid for my items quickly, my hands trembling slightly as I fumbled with my wallet. As I packed my bags, I glanced around one last time, my heart pounding in my chest. The store was still and silent, the shadows stretching long and dark across the floor. I grabbed my bags and hurried toward the exit, the uneasy feeling following me. When I reached the door, I glanced back one final time. In the reflective glass of the store's entrance, I thought I saw a figure standing just inside the store, near the back, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, only the dark shape looming in the distance. I hurried outside, the cool night air hitting my face, but the feeling of being followed didn't dissipate. I quickly loaded my bags into the car, glancing around the empty parking lot. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the dark figure following me. The streets outside were empty, the only lights coming from the street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. The store's glow faded into the distance, but the unease stayed with me. The sensation of being watched, of someone lurking just out of sight, lingered long after I had left the convenience store behind. Even as I pulled into my driveway and went inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still out there, waiting in the shadows. The bookstore was the kind of place that felt timeless, with its rows of shelves packed tightly with well-worn volumes and new releases alike. It was late, nearly closing time, and the store was nearly empty. The warm yellow lights cast a soft glow over the aisles, the scent of old paper and fresh ink hanging in the air. The occasional creak of the wooden floors was the only sound as I wandered through the aisles, picking up a few books I'd been meaning to read. The store had a comforting quiet about it, but as the minutes passed, the peaceful atmosphere began to feel heavy. I made my way deeper into the back, where the older books were stacked, their covers faded and spines cracked from years of handling. The shelves seemed taller here, towering over me, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. I scanned the titles, the soft hum of the store's lighting the only noise, but a strange feeling began to settle in the back of my mind. I moved from aisle to aisle, browsing the shelves aimlessly, but something began to gnaw at my attention. Every so often, I would feel a subtle shift in the air, as though someone had just passed behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The bookstore was as empty as when I arrived, the only other person in sight being the cashier at the front, busy arranging books at the register. I kept browsing, trying to ignore the sense of unease that was slowly creeping over me. The aisles felt longer now, the corners darker, as if the lights weren't reaching the far ends of the store. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a tension in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the store wasn't as empty as it appeared. As I turned down another aisle, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the far end of the row. My heart skipped, and I froze, squinting to get a better look. But when I turned fully, there was nothing there, just the neatly arranged bookshelves stretching on in both directions. The quiet was suddenly unnerving, the absence of sound amplifying my sense of vulnerability. I continued browsing, but my eyes kept drifting to the ends of the aisles, expecting to see something out of place. Every so often I would think I heard the faintest rustle of pages or the creak of floorboards, but there was no one in sight. I hurried my pace, eager to finish up and leave, but the unease wouldn't let go. As I made my way toward the front of the store, I passed by the section with oversized art books, their covers glossy and vibrant. I reached for one, feeling the thick pages beneath my fingers, but something made me stop. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a dark shape slipping just behind the shelves. I whipped my head around, my pulse quickening, but again there was nothing. The aisle was empty, yet the sensation of being watched was stronger now, more persistent. I set the book down and turned back toward the main aisle. The store felt different now, the once cozy atmosphere replaced by a strange, pressing discomfort. I started walking toward the register, trying to keep my focus straight ahead, but my peripheral vision kept betraying me. I could feel it, a presence lurking just out of sight, always on the edge of my awareness. I approached the cashier's desk, but as I passed the final row of shelves, something made me stop in my tracks. In the glass window of the display case reflecting back toward me, I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the aisle I had just walked past, tall and still, their silhouette blurred by the glass. My stomach dropped, a cold chill running down my spine. I spun around, my heart racing, but the aisle was empty, as if nothing had been there at all. I quickly turned back toward the front of the store, my hands gripping the books I had chosen tightly, and made my way to the cashier. I tried to keep my face calm, but my pulse pounded in my ears. The sense of being followed, of something lurking in the quiet shadows of the bookstore, was now unbearable. As I placed my books on the counter, I felt the strange sensation return, this time stronger, as though someone was standing right behind me, watching me closely. I resisted the urge to look back, my breath catching in my throat as I waited for the cashier to finish. The seconds stretched on endlessly, the sound of the receipt printing filling the tense silence. Finally, I grabbed my bag and hurried toward the door. The bookstore, which had once felt warm and inviting, now felt like a maze of darkened aisles and hidden corners, each one concealing something I couldn't see. As I reached for the door, I glanced back one last time. In the reflection of the store's wide windows, I saw a shape, just a blur of shadow, standing motionless near the back of the store. I rushed outside into the cool night, the door swinging shut behind me. The street outside was quiet, the dim glow of streetlights illuminating the empty parking lot. But the feeling didn't leave. Even as I walked to my car, my breath coming in short, nervous bursts, I couldn't shake the sense that something was still there, hidden in the darkened rows of bookshelves. I got into my car and locked the doors, glancing up at the bookstore one last time. Through the glass windows, the store seemed peaceful again, just rows of books neatly arranged under the soft glow of the lights. But as I pulled away, my eyes caught on something in the rear-view mirror. In the dim reflection, backlit by the store's warm light, was the faint outline of a figure standing just inside the entrance, watching me as I drove away.